as halachic leaders and spiritual leaders in the community, making halacha accessible in the community to women and men and men as well. Our morot halacha, some of them serve as rabbaniot in schools, teach in various midrashot, and are involved in research and writing. They take part, what's very in our generation, and to be part. They answer questions that they receive both personally and through the Matan Initiative, Isha Halakha, face to face with the Morot Halakha. The first 2 years of the Morot Halakha program, the women are trained in Tarat HaMishpacha and in life cycle events such as Avelut. And the women, many of the graduates continued, as Sharon has, to 2 years in Hilchot Shabbat, and now 2 years in Isur Beheter. Sharon has been, Dr. Sharon Grossman has been studying in Matan, the Halacha program, for 5 years. We are very proud of Sharon and our other graduates. And I want to thank Dr. Grossman. Again, this is your 3rd lecture already in the topic of Corona and of the chisunim, of the vaccination. And I was thinking, Sharon, about Miriam, who is the guardian of life. And I was thinking of what you really research and what you lecture and what you're involved in, and of your topic tonight, thinking of how we restore life, how we preserve life, how we keep all of us safe. So Sharon, I want to thank you again and thank all of you for coming, and pass on the microphone to you. Thank you, Dr. Gross.
Rabbanit Oshra, thank you for the beautiful introduction and for all that you do to promote the Morot LaHalacha and women's learning, not just in Renana or the Sharon, but throughout the world. 2 years ago, when we could still travel, we had a beautiful Shabbat in Sydney, Australia, and I walked into Shul and said I was from Renana, and I was greeted by people who said, "Oh, well, we have Renana here. We have Matan here. We have a program created by Rabbanit Oshra Koren," and I had such pride. So your teaching and your Torah reaches all corners of the earth. I'm very honored tonight to have Rabbanit Bina join us, as well as my parents. So let's begin. With your permission, I'd like to imagine a day in the not too distant future, when about a month after the 5 millionth Israeli has vaccinated, a national holiday, a day of dancing and rejoicing, a day where people are in the streets celebrating, where all the stores are open, a day for which the Rabbanut Harashit has created a unique tefillot to mark this occasion, and also a day when new policies are introduced to to protect us as we return to a new normal, a new routine. And so Mr. Goldberg on this day wakes up extra early to go to shul because he's looking forward to seeing all of his friends who he hasn't seen in the last year. And the shul's having a musical Hallel. It also happens to be Rosh Chodesh. And the shul is going to have a festive breakfast outdoors, socially distanced and masked. And he enters into the shul property, and he's suddenly approached by 4 Gabayim, wearing masks and face shields. And they say, "Mr. Goldberg, how are you?" He says, "Baruch Hashem." And they said, "Have you been vaccinated?" And he said, "No, I have not." And they then proceed to escort him outside of the shul property and explain this on the web. And explain to him that only people who are vaccinated may come to shul. And so he goes home devastated. That night, the Rav comes to his house to check up on him and says, "I saw what happened in shul. Are you okay?" And Mr. Goldberg says, "No, actually, I'm not." He bursts into tears. This was the most awful day. Instead of a day of celebration, this day turned into a day of humiliation for the Goldberg family. My daughter in 12th grade went to school, and they told her she couldn't come back because she was unvaccinated. My son went to the supermarket to buy groceries, and the police approached him and asked him if he had vaccinated and for proof of vaccination. He said, no, he hadn't vaccinated. They gave him a 1,000 shekel fine. My other son went to Mordechai Shapiro concert in honor of this day, to celebrate this day. And he was asked, do you have a green passport or do you have an immunity passport? He said, I don't. I didn't vaccinate, and he wasn't allowed to come in. But then my wife turned on her computer and she logged into the work site at work, the website, and she couldn't get in. She calls IT. IT says, have you vaccinated? And she said, no. I said, well, they tell her anyone who hasn't been vaccinated has been fired. Now, on the upside, his brother, who's always been a renegade, vaccinated and discovered that he had received a 3,000 shekel grant from the Israeli government for having vaccinated. And so he says to the Rav, I'll figure out what to do with my daughter. She'll get a 2 bagrut, and we'll pay the fine for my son. And okay, my son didn't go into the concert, but what will we do? My wife lost her job. How will we put food on the table? How can Jews treat each other this way? Does halacha permit any of the things that we experience today? And so I'd like to share with you the Rav's answer to Mr. Goldberg. In Israel, we are in a race to vaccinate 5 million people with the hope that we will achieve herd immunity. And herd immunity is an epidemiologic phenomenon by which if a certain percentage of the population is immune, then those that are not immune are unlikely to become infected. And in that way, the pandemic will end. And scientists disagree what the minimum level of immunity will be required to achieve herd immunity. Now, initially, there were reports of 60% of the population vaccinated. Last week, Professor Ash, the coronavirus commissioner in Israel, reported 80 or 85%, maybe even higher, given the new mutations that are more contagious. And Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease in the United States, perhaps the senior scientist in this area, has said even 90% immunity will be required to achieve herd immunity. Now, with a quarter of the population below the age of 16 and not eligible for the vaccine, and people who can't receive the vaccine for medical reasons, and people who have refused, we will only reach herd immunity if everyone who's eligible vaccinates. And so to try to encourage as many as possible to vaccinate and to create a safer reality as we emerge into a new routine, various policies have been proposed to promote public safety and safety from COVID infection. And so tonight, I'd like to explore with you these various approaches and what halacha might have to say about them. So let's start with a government mandate to vaccinate. And I'll just share with you my source sheet. So in Israel, over the last several months, there has been talk off and on about a government mandate to vaccinate. It's unlikely that one would be implemented as long as the vaccine has emergency use authorization. And until it receives more formal authorization, this is unlikely to happen. In the United States, if the government were to mandate vaccination, it would not be a federal mandate. The federal government doesn't have the power to enforce vaccination, but the states do, as well as cities. So in 1905, a pastor named Henning Jacobson, who lived in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, refused to take the smallpox vaccine. And he was placed in jail and fined $5, which today is equivalent to about $150. And he protested. He argued that it was his right as a citizen to refuse to vaccinate. And he appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled against him that public safety trumps his right to refuse vaccination. And that position has been maintained even till today. And so in 2018, Williamsburg in New York City imposed a $1,000 fine on anyone who refused to vaccinate against measles. How would halacha approach a government mandate to vaccinate? So we can answer this question from 3 different perspectives. Number one, how does halacha permit forcing people to perform mitzvot. After all, vaccination can be defined as a mitzvah, fulfilling the mitzvah of v'nishmartem mod lanafshotechem, lo tamod al dam reyecha, and ve'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha. Virtually all poskim have strongly endorsed the vaccine, and many have even obligated. And so, if halacha permits us to force people to perform mitzvot, then it is possible that halacha would permit a government mandate to vaccinate in the context of enforcing the performance of the mitzvah of vaccination. How does halacha approach, does halacha permit forcing people to perform mitzvot? And the answer is yes, halacha does. Rosh Hashanah Daf Vav Amud Aleph explains that someone who refuses to bring a korban, we kofinoto ad shiomar rotzani. We coerce him until he says, "I will bring the korban." And the Rambam asks, "Well, how can we do this? We know mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. We know that the performance of mitzvot requires intention. It requires will. And here we're forcing him. Where's his will? Where's his intention?" And the Rambam answers that in the essence of everyone's being, deep down in the heart of every Jew wants to perform mitzvot. But what happens? Sometimes their Yetzer Hara gets the best of them. And so when we coerce him, when we force him, we are just enabling him to find his natural desire to perform mitzvot. And who does this? Who enforces this? The Rambam explains that the Beit Din does this. The Ramban says the Beit HaMelech, the king and his representatives, and the Rashbash, Rav Shlomo ben Shimon Doran from Algiers, explains that Tovei Ha'ir enforce this. The leaders, the elected officials who are entrusted with the same authority as the Beit Din Hagadol in Yerushalayim, as the court in Jerusalem. But the Chazon Ish points out that when we force people to perform mitzvot today, we must be very, very careful that in the process, we bring them closer to mitzvot and not push them away. And so in Israel, there are mitzvot that are mandated or legislated by the government. What mitzvah? Well, Shabbos. The Israeli government has established laws that that make Shabbat a national day of rest for the entire country. And why is this legal? Well, the Supreme Court in Israel, the High Court in Israel, has ruled that Shabbat is a mitzvah that satisfies two criteria. It promotes a social good and it promotes a Jewish value. And so it would seem that halacha would permit forcing people to perform mitzvot that satisfy these criteria, that promote a social good and reflect a Jewish value. And vaccination, which protects the public health and promotes the value of pikuach nefesh, the value of the importance of saving a life, which is an essential tenet of Judaism, satisfy these criteria. And so one could argue that halacha would permit a government mandate to vaccinate based on the permission that halacha grants to force people to perform mitzvot, just as people under certain circumstances, we can force people or strongly encourage people or mandate that people perform mitzvot. So too, a government mandate can be permitted in that context. What about forcing people to receive medical treatment? Does halacha permit us to force people to receive medical treatment? And if so, perhaps halacha might mandate or permit a government mandate to vaccinate from the perspective of the mandate forcing people to receive medical treatment if halacha permitted. So Baba Metzia tells us a story of Rebbe who was sick and had an eye infection, and his doctor Shmuel comes and tells him that he should really put a cream in his eye, and he refuses because he's afraid that the cream might hurt him, it may hurt his eye and cause pain. And so Shmuel says, okay, put the cream on top of your eye. And Rebbe says, no, I'm afraid it's going to hurt. So Shmuel says, put the tube under your pillow. And he does that and he heals. And so based on this story, it would seem that halacha does not allow us to force people to receive medical treatment, and that we must respect a patient's wishes and his autonomy and really listen to him when he's afraid. But the Radbaz was asked, how do we approach someone? How do we characterize someone who refuses medical treatment on Shabbos for a life-threatening illness? Is he considered a Hasid Shoteh, a pious fool, or is this refusal considered midat shtut? Is it considered foolishness? And so he writes that someone who refuses his treatment, a life-saving treatment on Shabbos, is a chasid shoteh, ve'elokim et damo miyado yibakesh, v'torah amra v'chai behem v'lo sheyamut behem. He is considered a pious fool. And in fact, he writes, כללה דמילתא איני רואה במעשה הזה שום חסידות אלא עיבוד נשמה, הלקח מליטין אותו בעל כורחו או כופין אותו לעשות מה שעמדוהו והשואל הרי זה שופך דמים ופשוט הוא. We force him to take this treatment on Shabbos. And the Shulchan Aruch writes, when one doctor says to receive a treatment and another doctor says not to receive the treatment on Shabbos, we follow the doctor who says to receive the treatment. And the Magen Avram adds, Im lo ratzah hacholel lekabel tshuva kofin oto. We even force the sick person to take the treatment on Shabbos. Now, maybe we only force treatment under these circumstances because the sick person was under the misimpression that you shouldn't receive medical treatment on Shabbos. Maybe there's no room to force treatment during the rest of the week. And Rav Yaakov Emden explains that no, the same applies to the rest of the week. But we only force people to receive treatment that is refuah vada'it, a treatment with that's known to us, a treatment that has uncertainty. We do not force people to receive. If the treatment is known, we even cut off a limb if it's a known treatment of benefit. And we force someone hashkoto mashkin miziin ulachilo dvarim mavriin umasadim umemarakim umanakim b'dukim u'b'chonim shmoilim u'bilti mazikim. We force people to take drinks and foods that strengthen them without harming them. So the question is, how does a COVID vaccine fit into Rav Yaakov Emden's criteria for treatments which we are permitted to force people to take? On the one hand, one could argue that Rav Yaakov Emden would prohibit forcing COVID-19 vaccine because he is specifically addressing a situation where someone is sick with active life-threatening disease and the vaccine is being offered to people as preventive medicine to healthy people. Also, he permits forcing people to receive treatment for refuah vada'it, a treatment with a known benefit. And there are so many question marks associated with this vaccine, including the possibility of long-term side effects, which we anticipate will be very rare, but we just don't know. On the other hand, maybe it is refuah vada'it because we know with certainty that it is effective. It is 95% effective in preventing infection. Also, maybe we could classify the vaccine as food or drink or soup or something that strengthens the body without causing harm. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein limits the situation when we may force people to receive medical treatment to a very small, very specific situation when someone is very sick. Many doctors have come to him and explained to him what treatment he needs, and he just doesn't understand why, no matter how many times they've tried to explain it to him, and there isn't time to go find another doctor to explain it to him, and all the doctors in the city agree that he requires this treatment. Just under those circumstances, may we force him, but we must consider the psychological effects of forcing him to do this. However, in the context of someone who refuses to eat, a sick person who refuses to eat, Rav Moshe says, אבל בעל כורחו ממש שצריך להחזיקו בכוח ולהאכילו אין לעשות כן לגדול בר דעת כשאינו רוצה לאכול. We do not physically take someone and hold them down and force them to eat. We do not physically take someone and hold them down and force them to receive a treatment. Rather, how do we do this? How do we force them? By explaining to them, by being more patient, by trying again and again and again, and using means that fall short of force. Tzitz Eliezer quotes Rav Yaakov Emden as a proof that we may that we may physically force someone to receive a medical treatment. And so what do poskim have to say about vaccines? Can we force someone to receive a vaccine against his will? The Nishmat Avraham quotes Rav Neuwirth, who says that that we may not force them to receive a vaccine. And this is also the position of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Mordechai Willig, and Rav Herschel Schachter. However, perhaps they'd rule differently in the midst of a pandemic. So does halacha permit us to force people to receive medical treatment? It's a machloket. The thinking of the poskim leans towards education and encouraging other ways that fall short of physical force. And so a government mandate to vaccinate that is based on encouraging people, not pulling them out of their house and physically injecting them, but encouraging them in other ways, which involve education, with other incentives, would seem to be permitted by halacha. Third way of looking at this question of a government mandate to vaccinate: how does halacha balance public safety with the rights of the individual when the two potentially conflict, and what steps may be taken to ensure public safety? So the Baba Batra Daf Chet Amud Aleph explains that that a city can require everyone to contribute to the construction of the wall for its safety, including an orphan. And how is this done? Presumably through taxes. So taxes are a mechanism to mandate public safety, or to ensure public safety. Tzitz Eliezer talks about passive smoking in public places and explains that if someone is smoking in a public area and destroying and endangering the air for everyone around him, mutar limchot b'zeh, you can actually protest and yell at him. He quotes the Chaim Sha'al Chida, who explains that someone who harms a public bathroom, misalkinoto, we evict him, we make him leave. And so again, another mechanism to promote public safety, banishing the person who causes damage. The Rambam tells us anyone who says "Hareini misaken ba'atzmi umalech harim elai b'kach o eni makpid al kach makinoto makat mardut." Someone who harms the public, what do? We give him lashes. And finally, the Shulchan Aruch Shulchan Aruch codifies his position to law, and the Ber HaGoleh explains why we give him lashes, because someone who says, I'm going to endanger myself and others, ki'ilu mo'es b'ratzon b'ro ve'eino rotzeh lo ba'avodato v'lo b'matan scharo. It's someone who says, I don't care, I'm going to endanger myself and everyone around me, really despises his creator, says, I don't want anything from his work, I don't want any rewards from him either. And in Hilchot Talmud Torah, the Rambam offers us another mechanism another sanction that one may take for people who harm others, who endanger others, another sanction to ensure public safety. He lists 24 reasons or situations where one can put someone into chayrim, can excommunicate them. And one of them is mi sheyesh b'rshuto davar hamezik k'gon kelav ra o sulam ra'ua menadinoto ad sheyasir hezako. We may excommunicate someone who has a dangerous dog or a dangerous ladder until he removes the danger. And so, yes, when it comes to issues of public safety versus the rights of the individual, public safety trumps, and what mechanisms are in place, what sanctions may be taken to ensure public safety, taxes, evacuating the person who is dangerous, giving him lashes, or excommunicating him. Now, what do poskim say about those who refuse vaccination during COVID? And may the government, or is the government even obligated to take sanctions against those who refuse to vaccinate? And so Rav Sherlow wrote a tshuva on this for Tzohar, and he said, just as, yes, most certainly an individual has a right to refuse to vaccinate, and we must respect that right. But when that right compromises public safety, the rights of the many trump the rights of the individual, and yeshna hatzdaka lahagbil et mi she'eino mitchasen. The government has the right and the authority and the obligation to place sanctions on those who refuse to vaccinate. And he derives this from the example of a Kohen who infects others because he has neglected his health, and that Kohen is not allowed to recite the priestly blessings because he's considered a murderer, and so much. And the same applies to someone else someone who is not a Kohen who inflicts others. And again, the concern is that someone who's not vaccinated might spread the virus and ultimately lead to the collapse of the healthcare system. But these sanctions have to satisfy 3 criteria. They have to be proportional, they have to be based on epidemiology and based on facts and realities, and they must try, however much possible, to minimize damage to others. And so once the government implements these policies and issues these sanctions, it's our obligation to follow them, to conform with them, and to adhere to them based on Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is law of the land, which according to Rav Herschel Schechter and Rav Asher Weiss does not just apply to monetary matters, but also to vaccines. And so from several different angles, halacha would permit a government mandate to vaccinate based on the government's right to legislate the performance of certain mitzvot that satisfy the criteria of promoting the public good, based on the possibility of, or the permission that we have to enforce or impose treatments on people, again, not using force, but through education and other nonviolent means, and as well as the fact that public safety trumps the rights of the individual. And so while I have the right to drive in Israel, and I have the right to talk on the cell phone, and I have the right to go to public areas, if I drive the car too fast, and if I talk on the cell phone while I'm driving, or I go into a public area without a mask during COVID, or I go into a public area unvaccinated as we reach a new normal, the government has the right to place sanctions on me and even to fine me, which is what happened to Mr. Goldberg's son. How would halacha approach a vaccinate or terminate policy? So first of all, more than 70% of businesses favor a vaccinate or terminate policy, because a vaccinated workforce is less likely to become infected and lose work days have sick days because they're infected, less likely to infect others, less likely to go into quarantine, less likely, there's less need to disinfect the workplace. They're more likely to participate in business meetings, meet with clients, and customers will be much more willing to work with them if they are a vaccinated staff. And also, if there are people at work who are unvaccinated and someone gets infected, it's possible that that person who gets infected could sue the employer for getting infected at work. Is this policy legal? And the answer is yes. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has stated that it is, because the chances of becoming infected at work are high. It's a strong possibility. It can happen. And the employer has an obligation to create a safe work environment. But if there are employees who cannot vaccinate due to medical reasons, the employer is obligated to create alternatives that are safe so that he can continue working even though he can't vaccinate. Now, the employer is only obligated to offer alternatives to people who object to vaccination for religious reasons if this can be done at minimal cost, in contrast to those who have medical reasons where it has to be done across the board. And The United Airlines has actually announced that it will require all of its employees to vaccinate. Disneyland has announced this also. It makes sense for hospitals to require vaccination of its employees because they're at higher risk of infection, as well as they're more likely to, they are at risk to infect others, and they are already required to vaccinate against diseases like the flu. So how would halacha view a vaccinate or terminate policy? Well, it would seem that halacha would certainly permit it and might even obligate it. Dvarim peraf kaf bet pasuk kaf writes ki tivne bayit chadash v'asita ma'akel legagecha v'lo tasim damim beveitecha ki yipol hanofel mimenu. When you build a new house, build a ma'akel, build a railing. Otherwise, you may violate the negative commandment, do not place blood on your house if someone falls down. So Sifri points out, learns from this repetition of the word bayit, kitivne bayit, and lo tasim damim beitecha, that this mitzvah applies not just to the house you live in, but also Beit HaTeven, where you store your hay, Beit HaBakar, where you store your cattle, Beit HaEtzim, where you store your wood, Beit HaOtzarot, where you keep your treasures. And Rambam extends this mitzvah not just to the construction of a railing around your roof, but also kol davar sheyesh bo sakana v'ro'oi sheyachshol bo adam v'yamut, that you must remove every danger in your midst. Don't not just construct a railing, but remove every danger. So this is a very broad mitzvah, which includes removing any dangerous object in our midst and applies to not just our home, but places where we spit, places where we work even. And so the Betzel HaChachma, Harav Betzalel Stern explains the principle behind this mitzvah and where it applies. He writes, "Sarich l'mal ledatam dekol makom shederach bnei adam hitakev sham al kol panim k'sat zman ika chashasha ulai b'meshach oto zman lo yasim lev lehiyot nizhar v'yipol lachein yesh l'chayvo b'makeh." That this principle, the obligation to construct a railing to remove danger, applies wherever people spend a lot of time, and many people spend even more time at work than they do at home. And he continues and writes that dafka makom she'osim bo melacha she'eno yachol lehizaher chayav b'makeh, that specifically a workplace requires a railing. Specifically in the workplace, we must remove dangerous things. The Chazon Ish explains that there are two different ways of protecting ourselves. On the one hand, we can remove dangerous, on one hand, we can protect ourselves by avoiding danger. The other way to keep ourselves safe is to remove the dangerous object. And so when I go to work, if I go to work in a factory and I use a blowtorch a couple times a day, every time I use it, I must protect myself. I have an obligation to protect myself by wearing a face shield, by wearing a mask, and by wearing protective gloves. But I cannot protect myself from all of the dangers that exist throughout the day. I can't keep myself safe from all of those as well and worry about all of those. And so for those dangers, like the possibility of falling off a roof and the possibility of becoming infected at work, the employer has an obligation to remove those objects to create a safe workplace. And ideally, this should be done through education, by educating the staff on the importance of vaccinating, by creating vaccine-friendly work policies, like encouraging workers to vaccinate and give them a day off for the day of the vaccine or days after where they might not be feeling well, and even leading by example by being the first one at work to vaccinate. And only as a last resort, move to a vaccinate or terminate policy. How about the government grant which Mr. Goldberg's brother received? How would halacha view this? So several different proposals have been made for how this might work. In the United States, one of the proposals has been to offer $1,500 after the first vaccine to anyone who vaccinates, Another proposal is to offer $200 to anyone after the first vaccine and another $800 after we reach herd immunity. So that way, anyone who has vaccinated will encourage those who have not vaccinated to go get the vaccine. This policy will cost the United States government almost $3 billion. But nevertheless, it's thought to be cost effective because the costs of the continuation of the pandemic are far greater than the costs of these grants. And in fact, there's a hospital in Houston which offered its employees $500 after vaccinating, again, to promote their vaccination. Those who argue against this policy argue that it's really unethical and inappropriate to pay people for fulfilling a moral obligation. The message here is that the vaccine is dangerous and that people will only vaccinate if they are paid to do so. And that in the future, people won't take routine vaccines unless we pay them. Better spend the money on education. And the grants will have a differential effect on rich and poor, in motivating more poor people to vaccinate than rich people. So how does Halakha view this policy? Well, the Gemara in Bechorot, a Mishnah in Bechorot, tells us Hanotel scharo ladun dinav betelim, that a judge who receives payment for his decisions, his decisions are null and void. And the Gemara asks, Manahani Mili, from where do we know this? So the pasuk says, look, I have taught you, and just as I have taught, and so it's referring to God teaching Moshe the Torah, and just as God taught Moshe the Torah for free, so too we must teach Torah for free. And based on this, Rashi writes that it is inappropriate it's not appropriate for a Torah scholar to receive money for the Torah that he teaches. And the Mishnah in Avot says, Kol haneh midivrei Torah notel chayav min ha'olam. Anyone who benefits from his Torah learning, benefits financially, his life is removed from this world. And on this, the Rambam writes that that anyone who has a financial benefit from learning Torah receives the punishment of karet, which is very, very harsh words. He brings many examples from the Gemara of Tanaim and Amoraim, who did everything in their power to avoid receiving compensation for their Torah learning. And so it would seem, based on this, that one cannot benefit financially from the performance of a mitzvah. However, the Beit Yosef rejects the position of the Rambam, and he writes, "Be'emet lo nahagu chachmei hadorot kamoto, v'harayot shehevi ledvarav yesh lidchotam, v'adrabah yesh lahavi rayot lahachzik biyad hanotnim v'hamakablim, v'kein ra'oi la'asot, v'im lo kein kvar hayta haTorah batla." Chas v'chalila, v'al yedei ha'haspakot yicholim la'asok b'Torah v'yagdil Torah v'yadir. That no, in fact, the Rambam, he rejects the Rambam and says that there are many examples of people who did receive financial compensation for their Torah learning, and had they not done so, we would have lost the Torah. And the Ramah rules that actually it was customary to pay Torah scholars for their teaching. And so the Bach, the Shach, the Yamshel Shlomo, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Mishnah Brura, all reject the position of the Rambam and rule that one may receive financial compensation for teaching Torah. And so it would seem that yes, you can receive compensation for performance of a mitzvah. But you could argue maybe learning Torah is different, because they're learning Torah, the teachers who are learning Torah and teaching Torah are doing it at the expense of doing other work for which they could be financially compensated. And yet, nevertheless, there's a specific learning that would prohibit receiving compensation for teaching Torah. And in spite of that, the poskim rule that one may receive compensation for learning Torah. And so it would seem that yes, Torah, that the halacha does permit us to receive compensation for performance of mitzvah. But if you're not convinced, let's take the mitzvah of tzedakah. When you give tzedakah, you get a tax deduction. And so may one enjoy tax credits from giving tzedakah, and Rav Moshe, as well as Rav Kanievsky, have ruled that one may enjoy every penny from the tax credit. So yes, halacha would permit the grants to people who have vaccinated. What about immunity passports and green cards, which Mr. Goldberg's son did not have, and without them, he could not enter the concert. So there has been a lot of conversation about immunity passports and green cards in Israel. Green cards have been proposed for those who have vaccinated, as well as those who have been diagnosed with COVID and have antibodies, and those who have undergone a negative COVID test in the last 3 days. And this will entitle them to enter public areas. And so people who cannot receive the vaccine, such as those who are medically ineligible, and children, are potentially eligible for green cards, in contrast to immunity passports, for which only the vaccinated are eligible. And these will entitle them to, will exempt them from quarantine in the future. Now, there are many questions related to immunity passports. And they relate to a lot of the uncertainty regarding the vaccine. So what is, for how long will they be valid, these immunity passports? And the answer to that question depends on how long the vaccine will protect us, and whether the vaccine prevents transmission, questions whether the vaccine protects us against these new strains of COVID, which so far it does seem to. What about whether the vaccine will protect us against future strains that we have not yet identified? Would the government honor vaccinations outside the country? My parents, Baruch Hashem, have been vaccinated in the United States with the same vaccines we have here. Would they be eligible for an immunity passport? What about people who have been vaccinated in countries that don't use Pfizer or Moderna, like Coronavac in Brazil, which is only 50% effective? Will they be eligible for immunity passport? And what about the people who can't vaccinate? How do we treat those people in this larger context? People who argue in favor of immunity passports say we already have a precedent for them in the form of documentation that we vaccinated against yellow fever, which the World Health Organization requires for people to enter endemic countries. Those who argue against immunity passports, though, say it creates two different groups of people. It creates haves and have-nots. It creates people who are entitled to certain privileges and people who are not entitled to them. And so how does halacha approach this? Well, it would seem at first glance that halacha would strongly prohibit or not, at the very least, not support immunity passports, because Judaism values social justice, and we must do everything to promote social justice. After all, the mitzvah of tzedakah is of the highest importance. The Rambam says that we have to be most careful of all mitzvot, to say all positive commandments. We must be most careful in performance of the mitzvah of tzedakah. But there are limits to the mitzvah of tzedakah. Avraham ben Harambam, his son, explains that tzedakah is very different from paying someone who has done work for you. When you pay him for work that he has done for you, he is entitled to his salary. He earned it, he's entitled to it. Paying him is an issue of justice and fairness. Whereas when we give tzedakah, the recipient is not entitled to anything, and what we give is purely out of generosity and out of our voluntary. And so the Aruch HaShulchan also explains that there are limits to how much tzedakah you can give. Chayav adam lahakdim parnasato l'kol adam ve'eino chayav latet tzedakah ad sheyeh lo parnasato shene'emar v'chayei achicha imecha chayecha kodmim l'chayei achicha. that when we give tzedakah, there are limits, and the limit is you can't become bankrupt. You can't give so much that you have nothing left for yourself, because your income takes precedence over the poor person's income, because your life takes precedence over his life. And Rashi on the pasuk Potech Tiftach et Yadecha writes that that you are not commanded to make the poor person rich. The Ramban points out a contradiction in the Pesukim, talking about tzedakah in Dvarim Perek Vav, on the pasuk Hilo Yachdal Evyon Mikerav Haaretz, that there will not be a poor person. There will be poor in your midst. He points out that this pasuk contradicts a pasuk 7 Pesukim before that says there won't be any poor people in your midst. And how do we resolve this contradiction? The Ramban explains that in the future we will perform mitzvot and the Torah, and there will not be any poor people in our midst. But in our current reality, there will always be poor people. It is part of the fabric of our society, unfortunately. And so what does all of this have to do with immunity passports? Well, on the one hand, we must do everything we can to eliminate social inequality, to create a certain level of fairness between all of us. And on the other hand, in the case of the immunity passports, it's very easy to eliminate that social inequality by vaccinating. And very soon, Bezrat Hashem, the vaccine will be accessible to everyone in Israel. And so we can correct this inequality quite easily. But that's not necessarily the case with the rest of the world, because unfortunately, the poorer countries of the world will likely receive the vaccine much later. And so immunity passports reinforce that social inequality between the rich countries and the poor countries, reinforcing those financial inequalities. And so what is our obligation to those countries which will get the vaccine later? Well, from the example of tzedakah, we must give tzedakah, we must do everything to strengthen the poor, but there are limits. We do not, and the limits are that we don't take it to the point where we bankrupt ourselves. And so we must do everything in our power to ensure that the poorer countries in the world receive the vaccines as quickly as possible. But we are not obligated to bankrupt ourselves. We're not obligated to deprive ourselves of the benefits of having been vaccinated until those countries receive the vaccine. And Rav Gidon Rothstein has offered the following description, which I find very meaningful to the situation. He wrote, "Those who wish to fully join in the endeavor of furthering the prosperity of that society and worldview will become citizens. Those who sympathize with essential aspects of the society but choose not to join it fully cannot then expect the full benefits of the system that they have chosen not to join." So to be a full member of society, I must fulfill all the obligations incumbent on me. If I want to have enjoy the full benefits of being a driver, I must go through all the necessary steps. I must go for an eye exam. I must do theory. I must do driving lessons. I must take a test and pass it. I must fill out all of the appropriate documents from the Ministry of Transportation. And if I want to be a full member of society when we return to a new normal, in this world of COVID-19, I must fulfill all of the obligations incumbent upon me, including vaccination. How would halacha approach the very disturbing, unpleasant encounters of Mr. Goldberg and his family being banned from shul and being banned from school? So we've already seen that the Rambam, who writes that we may excommunicate someone for the following 24 different situations, including someone who endangers the public with a dangerous dog or a shaky ladder. We excommunicate him until he removes the danger. And the Ramah explains that the Beit Din has the authority l'garesha banav mi beit hasefer v'ishto mi beit hakneset ad sheyikabel alav hadin, that the Beit Din can even chase his children out of school and chase his wife out of shul until he accepts this position. In 2018, the Agudat Yisrael issued a position statement on measles vaccination and actually wrote, "We urge all schools, playgroups, and shuls to ban any child or adult who has not been vaccinated. This is nothing less than a matter of pikuach nefesh." And so halacha would permit these very unpleasant sanctions, banning people from shul, banning people from school. Rav Yashiv has said that parents have the right to demand that all the other children in their child's class are vaccinated. Rav Zilberstein has said that it's within the authority of the school administrators to only allow admission to children who are vaccinated. And so the last year has been a very difficult one for us. We've really experienced a modern day equivalent of a mabul, of a flood, which has required us to go into our homes, to our metaphorical teva for safety. And when the mabul ended, God gave Noach 7 mitzvot. Among them, the mitzvah to establish judges, according to Rambam, to adjudicate the other 6 mitzvot, according to the Ramban, to address a broader set of laws, including labor relations, abuse, theft, loans. And so in order to prevent another mabul, another flood, another disaster, another calamity. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we should be zocha to the waters receding, yakavu hamayim, and emerging from our metaphorical teva, our homes to a new reality. And this evening we've addressed several different policies that could be implemented to ensure the public safety in this new reality. Among them, a government mandate to vaccinate, policy of vaccinate or terminate, government grants to those who, to reward those who vaccinated, green cards and immunity passports, and banning the unvaccinated from Jewish communal life. All of these would seem to be permitted within halacha. However, best to begin with education and explanation and teaching. And so what happened to the Goldbergs? Well, the Rav sat with them until the early hours of the morning to try to understand where their reluctance to vaccinate came from. And it turns out that they had heard in social media that the vaccine harms fertility, both male fertility and female fertility. And so the Rav put them in touch with a doctor, a medical expert who could tell them what's known and what's not known about the vaccine's effect on fertility. And in the end, after a great deal of research and soul searching, the family decided to vaccinate. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
I'm going to open up the chat now if anybody wants to write a question, or you can also open your microphones. Okay, the chat is enabled. If anybody wants to ask any questions. Thank you, Sharon, for such an important and interesting lecture. I really hope that the picture that you've painted of a world where we're going to get past the corona is coming soon. We're all putting all our hopes on this vaccine. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll be able to have these lectures in person soon.
Amen.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How do we relate practically to a relative who refuses to vaccinate himself and his children? Do we have to ostracize them, ban them?
It's a very difficult question. I think we start with education. We try to educate and then we try to educate some more. And we take the approach of Rav Moshe. We go and find another doctor and another doctor and another doctor, or try to get to the root of the concern. And we can only do so much. At some point, we can't do anymore, but through education, when it becomes an issue of danger, that's a different issue. So when it becomes a situation where you can't they refuse to vaccinate and the family wants to get together, then everyone needs to decide how they're going to deal with that. But until you get to that point, education and patience and more education.
Thank you.
Sharon? Am I unmuted? Do you hear me, Sharon?
Yes, yes.
For you.
Okay. I'm going to tell you of a personal matter here in our family. And this is, I'd like your opinion. My husband travels to the United States. I don't know when he's going to be going again, but whatever, he has people who are waiting there to see him. And it's already 2-3 weeks after our second vaccine, whatever, we're consulting, we're figuring out when we're going to go. Now, he uses this driver, very, very fine man. And this man needs the parnasah, but he's a diehard non-vaccinator. Also the measles, he had all these with his children. They weren't allowed to go to schools in New York. And so we feel bad not using him, but we told him if we do come soon that we won't be able to use him. So we asked a friend to tell him, and the friend says now every day he calls her and he's educating her. He's educating her on why it is so terrible to get the vaccine. She says every day. So I don't think this idea of, what you mentioned of Moshe Feinstein with education, I don't think it's going to work. I mean, we've had it, last year, 2 years ago, when there was a whole issue with the measles vaccine. I mean, I just don't. I told my husband I don't think he would be allowed to endanger himself to ride with this driver who could have COVID at any time. Now, what is your, what would you say on this matter? I just would like to know from a doctor also. I mean, halachically, as well, but is this, what do you recommend?
So I don't think there's a safe alternative here. If there was a way for this person to do his job safely without exposing the Rav to COVID, then that would obviously be ideal. But you're talking about a car, a narrow space, and prolonged exposure. And so medically, it would be necessary. It would be very unwise to use him as a driver if there's a safer alternative also. And again, it sounds like there's no room for education here. This is someone who you can't change his mind no matter how much you try. And so I agree with your decision entirely.
Okay, I just, want to feel, because we will be depriving him of income, but I just feel it's it would be difficult to allow this. It wouldn't be the right thing. Yeah. Okay.
So from
I feel bad.
Sorry.
What?
So please.
I know. I'm just saying. I feel bad. But right. Chayecha kodmim. Yeah. Okay, what you wanted to say halachically?
No, I was just going to say that one of the issues that I was going to address, but there wasn't enough time for, was, can you fire someone in general? And certainly if it's a person's an ani, then the work could be considered staka, and there might be an issue of hatarat nadarim. And then there's a big machloket between Rav Moshe and other poskim. How do we, can you fire someone who has been hired without a date of termination on his contract? And Rav Moshe says you can't, it's like he's hired forever. The other poskim say, including the Chazon Ish, say, no, you can. But if you have just cause, then most certainly. And this would be, I mean, this is not only just cause, it's endangering, it's endangerment. And there's the issue of pikuach nefesh. So it's a very, very difficult and heart-wrenching, but it's what's necessary.
The only thing I thought of is if he did have, which I don't think he did, if he did have COVID and he has antibodies, what would you say then?
So what are his antibodies? You need to see those numbers. And
The
then
numbers,
the problem with the antibodies is, from what we're hearing, is even if the antibodies are not high enough, there are other parameters. It's a little bit, that makes the question more complicated.
Okay,
that makes the question more complicated.
Right,
but
I don't think that he said that he had it. So,
and then the other issue is, you know, if is there a different answer if you are if the customer here, if the person riding in the cab with him is a young healthy person versus an older person with medical problems. And when dealing with someone who is older, who might potentially have medical problems, I think it's a much stronger argument to say, find another driver than if he were young. But even in that case, there's plenty of room to say, find another driver.
yeah, okay.
Maybe
Thank
he's
you.
listening. Maybe he's listening right now.
I didn't send him the link. I don't know. He's just anytime. It's a little bit difficult.
I have a question, Sharon. I think it may apply to many of us in thinking about Pesach. So what's your opinion for grandparents who have been vaccinated to go to stay in their children's home for Pesach, where all the adults have been vaccinated, but the children have not been vaccinated because they can't yet get it? What is your feeling about that? I think that could apply to many people who are on this.
So I think that we need to, hopefully by then we'll have more information regarding transmission. Do people who've been vaccinated have the ability to transmit to others? And which would mean if not, then that would mean that you would be unlikely to transmit to your children who are unvaccinated, and the vaccinated children will be unlikely to transmit to you. But more importantly is the issue of the grandchildren who are not vaccinated and potentially could get infected by you if you can still transmit, or you could be infected from them. Depending, we don't know. There's so much we don't know here. We don't know about these new strains. We don't know if, right now it seems that the vaccine protects against these new strains, but what if there's another new strain that arises? So I think that the jury is not out yet. Please God, in the next few weeks, we should have more information. And then it's gonna be some very difficult decisions people need to make. The recommendation is to the vaccinated to continue to mask, to continue to socially distance. And I've seen various recommendations to visit the grandchildren, don't hug them, keep a mask on. There's no consensus here. And we're gonna have to see how this all plays out.
Okay, thank you so much, Sharon. I think a lot of people have gotten some practical information here, and we look forward to your next lecture.
Thank you so much. Lala Tov.